All right, well, let's get started. Zaffer, thank you for being here. It's great to have you on the
Sure.
podcast.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So for people that watch the show, you've seen Jeet and Pete from our end before, and then we have Zaffer from Novelis joining us. Let's start with, can you just talk a little bit about your role and what Novelis does, and that'll kind of set the stage as we jump into some of our topics here.
Yeah, so I'm an executive at Novelis. Novelis is an aluminum recycling and manufacturing company, the world's largest recycler of aluminum, global footprint. We make aluminum flat roll aluminum sheet, for a variety of applications, beverage packaging, automotive, aerospace, specialties. My background, a third of my career has been in operations engineering. A third of it's been in sales and marketing with a heavy emphasis on pricing, which I love to talk about. So appreciate the opportunity to speak about it here today. And then a third has been in kind of strategy, corporate development, and ventures. So look forward to the conversation.
Some of the topics we talked about were sustainability, commodities, quote unquote, which is like a fan favorite as we talk about pricing and sales, and just the way that you drive alignment, the way that you influence different parts of the business, some more broad leadership stuff. So let's start with that. I think that's a good kind of beginning point as we jump into some of these topics. What are some of the things that you deal with in driving alignment and in getting buy-in for some of your initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is the key when it comes to all of these types of conversations. Sometimes we get lost in the intellectual challenge of the change, be it trying to drive a new pricing strategy or a new pricing capability. But when it comes to changing ways of working, that's difficult, and you have to really be thoughtful about the ways of working. You have to understand what the losses may be and what the gains may be in order to drive the inspiration and drive the change. And there's not really a playbook. I mean, as much as certainly there are components of success factors when it comes to driving pricing transformation. Such as being clear on your ambition, ensuring that you have the right engagement from the right team members and stakeholder management to, invoking, best-in-class practices. But sometimes things go sideways, sometimes things go backwards, and just have to be prepared for that.
I was going to say, people say pricing, art, and science, mix of both. In some of your answer, there's a little bit of hearts and minds too, especially when you kind of have to operationalize pricing recommendations. As practitioners, we're kind of in the weeds day to day, and you can get pretty scientific, heavy data, but then when you have to roll things out, you might be talking to folks who are not at that level of involvement, and you really need to boil it down to something that's simple enough to understand. And I think that, the change management and behavior aspect is absolutely the why behind you should do something. There's carrot and stick. There's all these things that say, why should you do something different? Why is it good for the company? Why is it better for the individual? All of those factors come in. It's not just finding that, the sweet spot in the supply and demand curves.
No, and as you're talking, Pete, it reminded me of one story earlier in my career. You can get really intellectually stimulated by pricing. At least I do. I'm a pricing geek. I love to read about it. I love to talk about it. And I recall, so my first exposure was an engagement many, many years ago, pricing excellence, B2B, and value-based pricing. And I fell in love with this theory about, quantify the value add that you're providing to your customer, communicate it, and capture it. I kept advocating, as a change agent to the businesses that, hey, there's a lot of value to be had with this concept of value-based pricing and, theoretical, size of opportunity. And then ultimately, one of the business unit leaders said, you keep telling us about all this. Why don't you come in and do it? And so he brought me into a role kind of overseeing the business and overseeing pricing. And that's when reality hit. And so my first deal I went to the market with, did everything kind of in the playbook, went to the customer, negotiated it, and strike out. We lost the business. And second time around, fine-tune things, strike out, lost the business. And I give a ton of credit to the executive who sponsored me because, these were like deals that had been with the company. And I'm speaking of Novelis before my time at Novelis, is that, that had been with the company for many, many years. And it was really some of the soft skills and the soft stuff of that I was missing in the context of this point of change management, as well as some I would call scientific points of characterizing the buying behavior of the customer appropriately and not selling value to a price buyer, et cetera, et cetera. But the change management piece illuminated for me really early. But it's easy to get lost in the science. It's fun.
Zaffer, you've got sort of an interesting role now, but I think you had this type of a role in the past also, where you're sort of, it's almost like the corporate level, the center of excellence, kind of dictating it. One of the things that I get asked a lot, and I'd love to get your experience on it, is, first of all, pricing seems to be a very emotional topic internally for companies, and it especially gets magnified when we look at it by region or by country, and it gets really, really emotional. What are some things that you do to help drive some level of standardization? Obviously, there's uniqueness by market, so we don't want to take any of that away, but there should be some level of standardization, right? And we don't need to be Novelis specific about it. Just in your career, how have you kind of helped do that work?
Yeah, so look, for me, I got exposed to this. There was a framework from the team at McKinsey many years ago, and they wrote a book, The Pricing Advantage. I think it really does a fantastic job of laying out a common standard framework to look at pricing excellence in industrial B2B markets, which starts from transactional pricing, pocket price waterfall, understanding that, to value-based pricing, to industry pricing, understand supply-demand dynamics. And so what I found is that even kind of just bringing that unifying framework into the various diverse businesses, to your point, I mean, we had some businesses that are highly fragmented, dozens or hundreds of customers and, an intense number of suppliers, to others that were highly concentrated, right? Just a handful of customers and a handful of suppliers. And where you pull on the framework is a function of those businesses, but the underlying kind of science around those centers of excellence really apply. And that's how, in my experience, I've found to put some degree of standardization, which ultimately, when you seek to institutionalize that standardization, say with some technology, it allows you to do that, as opposed to just having bespoke solutions for every single region.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Tracy, I'd love to kind of move and get Zaffer's thoughts on the sustainability piece as a whole in the market, because one of the things that we're kind of thinking through, Zaffer, is obviously there's a lot of companies that are kind of betting on sustainability. You guys, Novelis, let's take it out because you guys are at the forefront. You're doing it already. So you're not making bets. You've already made that bet, right? So in a lot of these other companies, they're making a bet, but they're finding that customers they don't necessarily want to pay for that incremental value. And so there's a sort of a hesitation or a market friction that's there. And as that friction continues, your competitors are kind of catching up to them. And so they're kind of in this predicament where they're like, we were one of the early investors. Was that the right move? Or should we have waited for the other guys to go? And then we can be a month behind, a year behind, and it's okay because my customers are not ready to buy that way. What are some of your thoughts on that and some of the strategies that you've seen work well?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, Jeet. And I mean, I think what's clear, and I was talking to someone, I think it was from BlackRock or whatnot, one of these investment banks, is that the topic of sustainability is a boardroom conversation now with many companies, a large, overwhelming majority. So the investments that organizations are making in sustainability is real and broad and deep. The challenge is that, those are investments that come at a cost, and there's a return that's expected and should be expected. And the challenge of where various markets and industries are and their willingness to support that investment is where we're at. And so I think it's a bit early, Jeet, to kind of assess where this will land. I mean, I think you certainly have certain end markets within, maybe, consumer goods where the awareness of the end consumer and the demand and the pull from the end consumer is very direct. And subsequently, the investments that are made throughout the value chain can be appropriately monetized. In others where, it might be perceived more as a more fungible product, those become a little bit more challenging, because ultimately in those fungible products, the products are an expense item on the P&L. And so as you're trying to drive an increase on that raw material costs, it becomes challenging to kind of pass that along. And so I think companies and organizations have to really challenge to understand where the value is being created with the investment in sustainability of their customer's customer, and then subsequently convert that value into a language that is understood by the customer and the customer's customer. And in some cases, it might, mean new ways of pricing and new mechanisms and things like that. But yeah, I wish I had the silver bullet answer for you, but it is the billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar question that's being discussed everywhere.
Yeah, it is interesting, for us with some of our clients, we do see it as moving in some verticals, moving into this cost of doing business category. It's not a element of differentiation that you can price off of. It's moving into competitors are doing it, customers are asking for it. We kind of have to invest. We have to do it. Otherwise, we'll start seeing that market degradation from a share perspective. So it becomes a cost of doing business. And what we're seeing some clients do is trying to stop themselves from putting extra quota or extra burden on the go-to-market team without giving them the proper guidance of how to go get the extra margin, and not just use sustainability because it's not leading to extra margins. It's just more on that cost of doing business. So finding other ways to differentiate, other things to go get that incremental margin to be able to subsidize the cost and the investment that they've paid already.
So I would agree with that. I do think that there's different horizons. So I think if you look at where various industries are relative to what they can do, their degrees of freedom in investing in sustainability, there's a certain horizon that maybe it is a cost of doing business, and to a certain extent they may be already doing it. But to the extent that the world continues to push the curve of decarbonization and sustainability to the next horizon, then companies and industries will have to continue to make incremental investments.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it becomes really challenging to say, is it really just a cost of doing business? And I feel like some organizations and industries are seeing kind of this race of a competitive race of, let me go out and kind of advocate that I've got a more sustainable product, and they're trying to gain some incremental share. I would argue that those are potentially short-term gains to the extent that the market continues to evolve in a space, and at some point, the value has to be passed on. And so when and how that gets passed on is really the question.
I also struggle, honestly, with sort of customer fatigue at the end customer level, just because it's hard from an end customer perspective to know and really get to the details of which company is doing better than somebody else, right? In a B2B environment, it's the value conversation, the technical speeds and feeds of a product or solution or a service. That's a little bit easier. But the end customer level, if everybody is throwing sustainability or the fancy words, or everybody's kind of using the same language and lingo, there's a little bit of customer fatigue where they're not going to know where and how best to use their buying power, which causes a ripple effect of somebody that may have incrementally put in more dollars and have a more sustainable solution, that they're not able to monetize that the right way because they haven't kind of trained properly that end customer.
I was going to say the same thing. Zaffer, you were mentioning like how really the billion-dollar question is, how do you quantify or communicate the sustainability value? I would argue that it's in the same metrics of, cost reduction, revenue increase, risk mitigation, but how exactly you translate that is difficult. And I think an example of like an electric vehicle where the end consumer is demanding that, perhaps for their own reasons, that's an easier case to kind of track that through the value chain, or regulation and policy changes. It's like, hey, everyone shall do this. But every case in the middle of the value stream, I think for some less educated buyers or consumers for that matter, this greenwashing that you're describing, Jeet, sort of makes it difficult to differentiate when there's less education and standardization about what these things mean for different buyers.
Well said. And so, I would add, so fatigue, I would agree. I would add another word, confusion, right?
Yeah.
Because it's, let me just slap a label on. And it certainly, some of that is, as you alluded to, Pete, there's some greenwashing out there, but it's hard for the, consumers to navigate the complexity of what incremental investment is being made by a particular supplier based on, what's being advocated as, a sustainable product. And so there's still a lot that has to be done to drive the right standards, set the right regulations, and being able to advocate for and promote what products are being put into the market.
Yeah.
From your perspective, Zaffer, just this is like anything that you've come across in the last few months. Is there a company that stands out to you that is doing particularly well with this, that you're like, yeah, I like what those guys are up to?
So, I mean, I think, the first examples that come to mind are just really in kind of the consumer products and, food and beverages market. I mean, I think there's a real segment of consumers that are health and environmentally conscious. And so that comes from sustainable sourcing of food products and sustainable packaging associated with that. And so, be it some of the large consumer brand companies that have truly sustainable value chains and sustainable products and have been able to monetize that, through appropriate premiums, is where I turn to, for examples of where this, is actually being realized.
There's a company out here called Footprint, and they do sustainable packaging for goods. And they're just, knock on wood, they're doing really well. And they're able to do the scale packaging because it's hard to do environmentally friendly packaging at scale for the amount of goods we have. And they've kind of unlocked that a little bit, and they're able to do it, which is fantastic for them. And they're doing really well. So that's one, Tracy, that I kind of keep my eye on. But it's tough for them because it's hard for the end customer to know that this package is from two steps before that they're touching it, that they're using these sustainable practices over time. So it's a very interesting time for sure.
Yeah, and I would also say, Tracy, that it's also becoming a little bit broader in the sense, I mean, I think we're alluding to carbon footprint, which is certainly a big piece of it. But then there are some organizations that are looking at this broadly and the impact that they have on society in a more broader sense. Some call it conscious capitalism. So the likes of, Whole Foods as an example, or, Kind bars that have a much broader perspective of impact on society and the world. And they're able to see, that in their valuation. They're able to see that, in the prices of the products that they put into the market.
That's great.
All right. Maybe we pause there. I know we're a little tight on time.
Yep.
There you go, Zaffer. But I appreciate you coming on. It was great to chat, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Zaffer.